I just want to get these out of the way so I don't get confused. Oops. Where did that go? Yo, welcome to my channel. My name's JD and I'm an artist from Bristol in the UK. And as you've probably guessed from the title, today I'm going to be showing you a little tutorial on how to use marker pens. Now you might think, well that's easy Jay, you just take a marker pen and you colour in. Well, I've been using marker pens for years now, it's actually my favourite sort of medium to use. And I use this to colour in all of my drawings, and there's loads of different techniques and different ways you can use marker pens to achieve different results. So in today's video I'm going to be teaching you loads of different things, different techniques, ways of like layering, ways of blending. So the first thing I'm going to need is a drawing. So let's draw something sick. What can I draw? I know. Let's crack on. So now we have our drawing. Came out pretty sick, right? Now if you want to colour in this same design, I've actually made it available for download. I'll put a link in the description and you can download this design and colour it in. So you can either follow along with me, colour it in how you will, or you can even come up with your own design and colour that one in. Do what you want. It's a free world. So the next thing is to start using the marker pens. Now just to let you know, these marker pens that I have are pro markers. Now they're actually quite expensive and you can't actually achieve what I'm going to show you with sort of Crayola felt tip pens. So although they can be a bit pricey, they're definitely worthwhile and you can achieve some fantastic results with them. There's loads of different sort of markers like this out there, but the generic thing is these are alcoholic markers. Now that doesn't mean that you can have a little drink when you're chilling or halfway through a drawing, do you know what I mean? No, I wouldn't recommend it. But just to let you know, they're alcoholic markers and maybe I'll put a link in the description on where you can find them. So anyway, let's crack on with the colouring. So the first thing I've done is I've picked out which colours I actually want to use. I do this by laying down a bit of ink of all the different shades I have of each colour, and then with the ones that I don't need, I just basically get those out of the way so that I'm not confused on what colours I'm using. And I've just tested out a bit of blending, comparing it to my reference, just checking all the colours are right, so that basically I have all the pens that I need and they're all sort of organised, nice and easy to use. I also have a blending tool. Now this actually has no pigment of colour ink in it, it just has the liquid that comes with it, and I'll show you how to use that later on as well. And I know I said I'm using pro markers, but I also have a few different types of markers just because they match the reference a little bit better. You only get one shot with markers, you can't erase them, so it is always good to have a little practice and practice with your blends and make sure you get the right colours before you start doing your artwork. Now I made this mistake myself, which is pretty stupid because I'm making a tutorial video, Maybe I'll insert a little clip in the end just for a laugh. But basically, I ended up having to redraw the whole artwork again. So it is always good to have a little practice first. So let's take our newly made artwork and let's colour this beast. The first step is to lay down a foundation. So you pick what colour is the closest and just basically layering in one of these colours. This colour basically in my reference is actually just a solid one colour. So this is the colour closest to it. Now when laying down the ink, the key is to try not let the ink dry so you don't get those smeary sort of lines of your strokes. And I must say this paper that I'm using is a marker paper which actually has a finish to it that helps keep the markers wet on the surface whilst you're working with them, and it also helps prevent bleeding, which means when the ink goes down on the paper it doesn't spread out across the paper apart from where you've put the sort of ink down to on the page. And basically you just layer down, and I work from one side to the other rather than sort of working one area and working my way up. I worked all the way down trying to keep my strokes sort of consistent and just laying down a good even layer of the colour. And when this dries you'll see there'll be no strokes of where I've been, it'll just be one solid block of colour almost as if it was printed. Another thing to point out is when you're getting close to your black inked lines, it's quite a good idea to just be careful as you're approaching them with the ink, because the wet ink from the marker can actually reactivate the black ink and cause smudging into the colour that you're trying to lay down. So I'm always sort of extra careful when working up to the black lines. But basically, as you can see, I've filled in this blue that is on the blades and it's drying up nicely with no streak marks or anything. So that's basically how you lay down the ink. The next thing I do is I take the next shade in this area and I layer it over the top of the blue that I've already put down. Now I could have left a gap and coloured this blue section in, but for me I just find it easier colouring this block section of blue and then layering the next colour on top of that. Sometimes, depending on how dark your shade is that you're layering on top, the layer underneath can also sort of come through and you can keep some of that trueness of your first layer colour, also putting the new layer on top. So this is also another reason why I do this. So basically I just fill in the next layer and we'll crack on with the next bit. Right now I have a section which goes into this white and it's just like a very sort of washed out blue fading up into that white. So I've taken this marker, it's a very light blue, it's almost not quite visible, but I've layered it in quite thick at the bottom, and then as I go up I wisp it up so that the pen is coming off of the page at a very quick motion, so it almost gives it that blend into the white without being sort of a solid colour and then cut into that white. So you don't have to use the blender tool necessarily, you can just whip it up, and as long as you're moving that marker quick enough and pulling it up off the page, you will get that sort of blend up into the white. And also you can see the blue sort of quite a lot at the moment, but just to let you know, as the ink dries it will become a lot lighter. Let me show you the other technique with the blender tool. Now if you hold the blender tool upside down and place it on the tip of the marker that you're using, as you can see the liquid from the blender tool will go into the top of the tip of the colour. Now what that will do is it will enable you to lay down less pigment of colour at the start. So I'll show you this with a bit of a darker pen so you can see it a bit better. So I take this red and I push a bit of the ink from the blender tool into the tip. The more upside down you hold it, the better it works. Also, the longer you hold it there for, the less pigment of colour you'll have when you start applying it to the paper. So as you can see, when I first start applying this, it comes out sort of a pink, a very faint red. As you proceed going down the page, then the pigment of the colour starts coming to the tip of the pen and you can get this nice gradient. So that's basically one way of doing it. But there's also another way of using the blending tools. The way of doing that is by basically just laying down a bit of the ink from the blending tool onto the page first. Now when you do that, and then you lay the ink down on top from the marker, because of the wetness and everything, it will not be quite as vivid as you can see here. You can also use the blender tool to blend it back in again. As long as your ink's wet, you can manipulate it. And that's basically the other way of using the blending tool for sort of one colour. And I'll do it a bit darker here so you can see how I can blend it with the tool. Like I said, as long as that ink's wet, you can manipulate it, you can push it around on the page. So basically that's how you use the blending tools. I would also recommend, if you've been using it, just to push it around on a blank page and make sure you get all of that pigment of colour out of the tip. You just don't want to cross-contaminate this with other colours. So like I said, it was actually really quite pale when it dried, so I'm just adding another layer and using that blending tool to blend it into the white. The next bit, I'm going to use the other technique that I just showed you, where I'm going to be laying down a little bit of the blended ink first. And then what I do is I take the colour of the ink that I'm going to be using after, and I go over the top of that in a circular motion, because I want a sort of circular fade out. And once I've done the blue colour, I also go back to the blender, just blend it in a little bit more whilst that blue's still wet. And then I proceed to go around with the blue, and the blue will actually fade into that centre section. Now the reason you see me flip the pen round is a lot of my marker pens are actually running out. So the other end is actually really dry and not really pumping out much blue, so that's the reason for that. So I basically fill in the outside, and when it dries you'll see a nice gradient into the middle using that technique that I just showed you. The same goes for the next step. I just lay on the next layer, the next dark shade of blue, and I'm just layering that over the top of the existing layer that I've just done of the light blue, and using that technique again. If there's an area that I don't want to be too dark, I'll lay down a bit of that, and then I'll put the ink on top and then go back to the blender again and then pull that ink across, and that will blend it into the lighter tone underneath. So I'm just doing that process all over the eyes, laying down a little bit more, putting it down, and then going back to the blender, and then whilst that ink's still wet, I'm just pushing it around just to give it that nice soft smooth blend. The next bit is basically what I'm going to be doing around the whole picture. So the first thing I do is I take my section that I'm going to fill in, and I start off with the highlight, and this is a blue section. I'm using the lightest blue I've got. Then whilst the ink's still wet, I take the next colour and I start from the highlight, and I do this just because that's where the ink's still wet. Now if I wanted to blend it in, I can take my blender tool and I can, whilst the ink is still wet, manipulate the blends where I want them to be. So there's a little blend at the bottom which I'm going to put in, and then I continue with the main bulk of colour going around that highlight. and I basically just fill that whole section in, and I'm using this as my ground colour. So this is going to be my basic colour, and I'm going to be layering my darker shades over the top of this one. As long as this layer stays wet, when I go over the top with my darker shades, I can blend them quite easily. Or if I don't want them to blend too much, then what I would do is I would wait for this section to dry before applying my next shade of blue on top. So whilst that dries, I'm just going to fill in the next section, again starting with the highlight, and just working around that highlight. You don't have to use the blend tool, you can actually use the colour from underneath to blend in from the darker tone. This works actually really well. But you are going to make that centre section just a tad darker because you've got two layers on it, so just bear that in mind. So I'm basically just using those highlights and my main bulk colour and just filling these sections in. Now the bottom layer is dry, I can go ahead and put on my next shade of blue over the top. I'm just mapping out the area that I'm going to be shading, just basically filling that in there. Parts that I actually have blending into this bottom layer blue, what I'll do is while the ink's still wet, I'll take the bottom layer blue colour and I'll use that to blend into itself, and just pulling the darker blue with it. Now when this dries, you'll see it will dry almost the same colour as the layer underneath, just a little bit darker, and you'll end up with a nice smooth soft blend. Once you've done that, continuing round with the rest of the dark shade of blue and just filling in those areas. Again, being careful next to the black ink. You don't want to go over the black ink if possible and smudge it into the blue, so just be wary of that happening whenever you're working close to those black ink lines. But basically that is the process that I'm going to be doing throughout the rest of the piece now, and these are basically all of the techniques and everything you need to know for the rest of the piece. One little tip to help you with those black inked lines, and if you're getting the smudging, is rather than dragging the marker across the page, try dabbing it around those areas where you have quite a lot of black ink and is quite tight and small to get into. I mean, if you can do it without touching the black, then great, but otherwise a dab should be a little bit more forgiving. Also, what you can do is if you do end up with a bit of black ink on it, just dab it off onto a scrap piece of paper. But dabbing is always quite a good way of trying to eliminate pulling the black ink away from where it should be and going into the yellow. As you can see here, I've managed to pull some of the black off, and I can just get rid of that on a scrap piece of paper. Another thing I like to do to try and not get that black into the yellow is to colour in the section in the middle first and then approach closest to the black lines after, just to make sure that that centre section isn't going to have any of the black ink pulled into it. Just going to do one last thing. just finish it off. I'm going to add some of my paint pens here, and I'm just going to add some of the highlights. And we are finished. Yeah, it came out pretty sick. What do you think? I had a lot of fun creating this piece, and hopefully you enjoyed the video. Maybe you learnt a thing or two. If you did, it'd be sick if you smash that thumbs up button and give it a like. And if you'd like to see any more tutorials, maybe different mediums, because you know I do quite a lot of different things, then just let me know in the comments. I always look at my comments and interact. So yeah, basically, that's pretty much it. I've got quite a lot of sick stuff lined up in the pipeline, so it'd be sick if you could subscribe, and until then, I'll see you in the next one. Now, I would have used a bit of a lighter grey, but it's actually ran out. But it does actually dry. I think I might have just messed it up actually. I should just use the darker grey for the others. Well, this is going well.